In 1983, Steve Gerber and Jack Kirby team up for Destroyer Duck for Eclipse Comics. And in issue number 4, they take some serious shots at John Byrne. Why did they do it? What led to this? Well, a year earlier, in 1982, an editorial piece written for Comic Scene magazine, issue number 2, sowed the seeds for what would happen in that issue of Destroyer Duck. I'm going to fill you in and tell you the whole story on this edition of Comic Book Canon. That's right. Welcome back. Thanks for joining me. I am your host, Comic Kid 84. Comic Book Canon will be a probably sporadic series of, when I come across some stuff in my collection in the comic world that provides a story that goes beyond what's on the page and kind of gives us a peek into the world of comics at that time. I'm retroactively calling my video story about Sensational She-Hulk Brian Boland cover, episode 1 of Comic Book Canon. If you missed that, it was an odd tale of how a cover came to be and a bizarre move that Marvel pulled to try and keep the peace. The link for that video is right here. Okay. Now on this edition, as I said, we're talking about Jack Kirby, John Byrne, Destroyer Duck. And I'm going to give you the lowdown. Because in this issue, they introduce a character called the Cogburn. Okay, and the Cogburn is a character that's used as, a proxy in a vehicle to take shots at the one and only John Byrne. And I'm about to get into that. All I'm going to show you before, to give you a little taste of the context, is this article on creators' rights written by John Byrne. I just want you to see this little quote here. I am a cog in the machine, which is Marvel Comics, and I rejoice in that. So remember that little quote as we learn about and take a look at the Cogburn that is in this issue of Destroyer Duck. The main slam here happens in this 2-page spread. I think it's page like 5 and 6. And basically we're just going to cruise through these panels and we're going to pop through them together. Okay, so the Cogburn, the type of it's kind of like the bad guy in this book. So the Cogburn, Good Corp is the major bad guy company in this story. I think it's safe to say Good Corp is like Marvel Comics. So in reference to the Cogburn, obviously a mashup of the word cog, like he used in the article, and John Byrne. Good Corp uses them like freelance agents, shuttling them all over the globe, from one hotspot to the next, under conditions a man with any real sense of self-worth would refuse to tolerate. HOQ is probably crawling with them. That's another company in this story. Notice I said facsimiles. They couldn't precisely duplicate the original. They were able to imbue the copies of his loyalty to the company and severe ascetic temperament. When they say duplicate the original, they're referring to, like, Jack Kirby and these OG creators are the original they're talking about. Again, I'm going to fill in more context, but at first I just want to set the table with this page. So they tried to copy the original. They got his temperament, but not his intelligence. The copies were always stupider incapable of independent thought, and mindlessly self-destructive. Again, these are the Cogburn that they're talking about. The scientists compensated for those deficiencies are redesigning the Cogburns in a quasi-human form they call a pregnate. Okay? Each Cogburn carries with it the seed of its own replacement. When a Cogburn dies, its spine tears free of its body, hides in a dark place, and grows another spineless form to wear it. Naturally, the Cogburns themselves remain ignorant of all this. The machismo posturing, the overblown ego, and the company man mentality are all artificially encoded in their genes. They never question what the company tells them, because to do so would threaten their own self-image. Sooner or later, any inquiry would lead to a disturbing truth, that humans exist who possess the capacity to create something new, something beyond a flawed replication of what's gone before. Where does he say that? Oh, and that would pose an even more threatening question, because the Cogburns were designed with no genitals. Oh, shit. And lastly, on this page, a Cogburn assumes that everyone is configured that way, so it remains stable. Confronted with the reality, well, no one knows what would happen if a Cogburn's ego were ever seriously threatened. And then here you see a guy with red hair, like John Byrne, taking off his shirt saying, "Damn, I'm good." Whoa. So obviously, Gerber and Kirby use this Cogburn concept to really describe a spineless, unoriginal, genitalless creature who's just a carbon copy of anything original. That's some pretty harsh stuff. I mean, Cogburn is a fairly on-the-nose, you know what I'm saying, name for this character. So what led to such, you know what I mean, snide remarks, such a concept? Well, like I said, a year prior, John Byrne wrote this article about creators' rights and referred to himself as a cog in the machine, which is Marvel Comics, and I rejoice in that. So this is a time, early 80s, comic books are really starting to get more mainstream. We're talking big money. We're talking toys, movies. And, you know, this scuttlebutt here is that, you know, creators are starting to get disgruntled about their compensation, their piece of the action on all these other properties, right? At this time, Jack Kirby is neither at Marvel or DC. He's working for, putting out work for Eclipse Comics. So Jack Kirby, as the cover of the magazine says, Kirby takes on the comics. So he was in full righteous, well, he thought, righteous mode here, against the man at this mode. And we're going to dig into the John Byrne article that he wrote and highlight some of the excerpts from that. And there's also a pretty sweet Jack Kirby interview in here, which we're also going to touch on. We're just kind of going to like flesh this out a little bit and give us two sides of the coin: the king and the cog, ladies and gentlemen. So let's set the table first on, as far as this magazine goes, with the John Byrne article, okay? So let's pop this on here. Now again, this is on creators' rights. We're not going to read the whole thing, but we're going to pop through some of it. Basically, this is, while all this kind of sentiment's going on of these creators not being happy with what they're making and their piece of the action from these properties they create. John Byrne is kind of on the other side of that fence and is kind of representing for, as he says, he's a cog in the machine of Marvel, and he rejoices in that. So he clearly has a different take on it. So let's read a little bit of this. And hopefully this helps us follow along here. For those of you who may have been lucky enough to have missed out on the fun, there's a movement growing among comic professionals which, carried to its logical outcome, would see everyone get their due and proper recompense for their creative efforts. This is above and beyond the flat page rate artists and writers receive, even beyond royalties, which was a recent addition from DC Comics. Marvel was still not doing royalties. This is a piece of the action. Okay. He goes on to talk about Siegel and Schuster, who created Superman, because they were kind of a notorious case of that. Superman went on to become massive, the foundation of which superhero comics built on. And I think to this day, he's still the most famous superhero. And, they kind of got a notoriously raw deal. So, John Byrne makes the point. Most of us remember the Siegel and Schuster suit from a few years back, in which creators of Superman sued for the ownership of their brainchild. The suit never made it beyond saber rattling, and DC quickly, settled. Now, he says, on a purely human level, were Siegel and Schuster entitled to their pensions? Yes. But on any other level, sorry, but the answer is a fat no, says Byrne. They may have been two little dumb hicks from the Midwest, unfamiliar with the machinations of the publishing industry in the 30s. But they were also creators of the single character whom the rest of us created in industry. But he says, but the fact remains that the character had been generally rejected. But then the infant DC Comics took a risk and bought the idea. He says, don't be fooled by the paltry sum they were paid, generally reported to be something a bit under $200. That was a lot of money in 1938. I checked on what the inflation rate is, and $200 in 1938 equals a little under $3,500. He makes the point, one kind of valid point that he makes is they created Superman, but Superman went on to become something else, and other writers and artists start adding to it. And I kind of thought that was interesting. Like, it made me think of Rob Liefeld. So I'm pretty sure Rob Liefeld is he's making some money off these Deadpool movies. And what's kind of interesting about that is he created Deadpool, yes. But probably one of the things that's like most famous about Deadpool is that he breaks the fourth wall, right? If it wasn't for his fourth wall breaking, I don't know if Deadpool is Deadpool. And Rob Liefeld didn't create that. He wrote him as like, at most, he was kind of like wisecracking. Like, he definitely had a mouth. You could say he was like Merc with the mouth from Rob Liefeld. But it was in the Joe Kelly run in like the late 90s, 1997, is the first time that Deadpool breaks the fourth wall. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. You create a character, but what about other people that add to it later? Where do they come into it? So John Byrne kind of makes that point about Superman, saying, yes, they created it, but, once it was in DC's hands, they put other creators on it, and they increased the lore of Superman. Byrne goes on to say, comics are an art form masquerading as a business, or vice versa. And he makes his main point here is creators want a piece of the action when it makes money. But if it takes a loss, the creators are never willing to give any of the money back. And that's like his big point. as he says here, is there anyone out there willing to return the money they made while producing some of these duds? Is that a thunder of silence I hear? I thought so. That's where my anger comes from in this whole business of creators' rights. I know I have of late taken on the mantle of a company man. Notice they use the word company man in the Destroyer Duck book. And in many ways, I am deserving of that title, even proud. I am a cog in the machine, which is Marvel Comics, and I rejoice in that. When I speak of Marvel down the years, I often say we. We did this, we did that. Kind of like, like your sports team. So that apparently was a controversial, you know what I'm saying, article at that time when things were pretty contentious. Let me just pull up the second page of that. It was a 2-page article. I'm not sure if there was anything really worth going on, but he goes on to say, like, use words like this saying, childish and unfair. And he's referring to people that, upset about not being part of the action. That is childish and unfair. And he kind of just says, hey, we're lucky to have this deal. Okay. So yeah, that created a lot of waves back in the early 80s. John Byrne's article about creators' rights and creators' compensation. Now, I'm not going to get too into my thoughts on the matter. They're both legends, Kirby, and we're going to get into the Kirby part of this. Kirby and John Byrne, both legends. They both kind of have some valid points. I will say John Byrne, though, was pretty, he worked a lot. Like, he had so many books going at Marvel. It was probably wasn't too bad being John Byrne at Marvel. And I don't know if every creator had that same kind of setup going on. You know what I mean? So let's touch on Kirby takes on the comics. I thought this little insert was cool. Kirby in his living room studio, surrounded by his work. He holds a Spider-Man poster, one of the many characters he created for Marvel. So that's kind of interesting, because I feel like not everyone puts Jack Kirby as synonymous with Spider-Man, because he really didn't work on the run. Ditko primarily did, and Stan Lee. But apparently he did create the man, Spider-Man. Let's see. Kirby has been outspoken in his support of the movement of creators' rights. As the most successful and prolific creator in the history of comics, Kirby has suffered the most from the system, which he considers grossly unfair and harmful to the very industry it's designed to help. Though his creations have brought him much glory, the profits have always gone to his employers. Kirby is now voluntarily drawing a book for free, Eclipse Enterprises' Destroyer Duck. In fact, all the people working on this book are working for free. Destroyer Duck was a fundraising enterprise to help Steve Gerber with his lawsuit against Marvel. And that's a whole other story. Come on. That's a whole other story. What the heck? Sorry, my scrolling is kind of hurting. That's a whole other story, but it revolves around Howard the Duck. Steve Gerber created Howard the Duck, and he was suing Marvel. Because, the Howard the Duck movie came out, and he became a really popular character. So there was a lawsuit revolving around that. Kirby goes on to say, makes this point about the lack of incentive, a need for restructuring. I feel the independent publishers are going to grow. He's right about that. Only a fool can function under the old comic structure. Why should a man draw a good picture if they're going to give it to 3 other guys? Why should a man write a good story if the company keeps it? Why should a man even ink when he's not sure whether the company will take care of him? Kirby views the overgrounds, which opposite of underground, mainstream. Kirby views mainstream comics as ads for toys. They don't get sales, but they make awfully good-looking ads for the toys. They're not even comics. They're just an approach to a toy franchise. Shit. So at this point, Kirby was, fairly salty at the comics industry. We're going to go on to another page of this. Page 2. There's something interesting that he talks about here. About, things not just being on merit. He talks about knock letters. Check out this this concept of knock letters. Down here. The health of a comic book can be manipulated by the staff alone. So, sorry, my scrolling is bad. The health of a comic book can be manipulated by a staff alone. You fill up a book with knock letters, negative criticisms in the letters pages. The reader who picks up the book and reads all those knock letters knows that this book he's reading, well, it ain't so hot. And if you do that consistently, it becomes a bad book. Yeah, so he's talking about the staff, editors and whatnot, sandbagging the book by publishing a bunch of knock letters. I've seen a lot of guys who never get the chance to develop, and you can't develop with 2 or 3 issues. You got to give a man a chance to stay in there, take his beatings, or succeed. A guy will create a book. Another will fill his book up with knock letters. He's off in 5 months or 3 months, and the other guys get the shot. Until now, Kirby has spoken in even tones, but now his emotion breaks through. I see it as a serpent's nest, and in a serpent's nest, nothing can survive. Eventually, all the snakes will kill each other. When I said that Marvel and DC were really ads for toys, I meant it. They'll give the staff the chance to develop, but not the men who create. You know what I'm saying? Let's see. Talks about Stan Lee a little bit here. At this point, he's kind of at odds with Stan. He says, when asked what Kirby's contributions to Marvel Comics are legendary. When asked what he received in return, he says, a lot of ingratitude. It hasn't left me bitter. It's just that it shouldn't work that way. If there's anyone who knows Stan Lee, I'm the guy who knows him. Stan Lee as a person, god damn my scrolling sucks. Stan Lee as a person is no better or worse than anyone else. I wasn't competing with Stan. I got along very well with Stan. We were good friends. And my God, I came up with an army of characters. Yet when Kirby returned to Marvel in the mid-70s, things seemed to have changed. I felt that Stan Lee's plan somehow didn't mesh with mine. Stan was already a publisher at that time, and he could call the shots. And when you can call the shots on somebody, you'll always win. By the way, he's not going to call John Byrne out by name in this particular article. Again, this was that John Byrne article was published at the same time as this. So I don't think he would have really been on Kirby's radar just yet, you know. There's another funny thing that he has to say about Stan Lee says he created a bunch of characters. However, he's long been privileged to collaborate with artists, you know, who would help him out. One of these artists is Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby says, golly, sorry guys. Let me get this on track here. This video is going to be terrible. He mentions the Jolly Jack thing. Kirby remembers it somewhat differently. I wrote them all, he states flatly, about all the characters. He says he created all the characters. But what about those Smile and Stan and Jolly Jack credit boxes? Kirby responds diplomatically. Well, I never wrote the credits. Let's put it that way. I would never call myself Jolly Jack. And I would never say the books were written by Stan Lee. That part made me chuckle. That, from what I understand of Jack Kirby, he would never call himself Jolly Jack. That was probably a rib on him to begin with. But yeah, he goes on to say he created Spider-Man, he created the Incredible Hulk, but he didn't get the recognition he deserved. Or like creator rights. So, this goes back to, I guess, a counterpoint to what John Byrne was saying. Well, if you want a piece of the action, you better be ready for a piece of the failure. Yeah, no doubt. But if you have a guy like Jack Kirby who prolifically created all these characters, those characters went on to make Marvel Comics serious money. That poses the question: is he entitled to a piece of the action? He was hired. He did art for hire, stories for hire. That was the question. I don't necessarily know the answer. But apparently, those two opposing, viewpoints surfaced themselves on the pages of Destroyer Duck, issue number 4, when they described the creation of the Cogburn, a slimy, spineless company man designed with no genitals. So they kind of took the gloves off. Gerber and Kirby did on that issue of Destroyer Duck. I thought it was kind of funny. I feel like this video is probably kind of a train wreck, but here it is. We did it in one take, all right? We did it in one take. We got through it. I appreciate you guys hanging out. Let me know your thoughts on this dynamic of creators' rights. Do you side more with John Byrne, Jack Kirby? Let a brother know. Till next time. Peace out.